The year is 1580, and the shadow of the Black Death has fallen once again on the heart of Europe. A city is suffocating under the weight of pestilence, its streets a graveyard of unburied corpses, its air thick with the stench of decay. Amid this chaos, a singular figure moves like a harbinger of death itself. Cloaked in black, with a mask so grotesque it seems almost a parody of life, this man is both savior and executioner. His every touch a judgment. But beneath the mask, behind the steady hands and reassuring words, a far darker truth lurks. The plague doctor's cure is a ruse, his true aim something more sinister. For in the depths of this epidemic, he is executing patients not to save them, but to steal from them. Hidden treasures, buried secrets, and lives lost not to disease, but to a cruel, merciless greed. How far can you trust a man sworn to protect you? In this video, we unravel the haunting tale of the Spanish plague doctor, a figure shrouded in both myth and reality, whose actions blurred the line between healer and murderer. If you find the depths of this tragic story compelling, make sure to subscribe and like the video for more untold tales of history's darkest moments. Now, let's dive into the macabre world of a man who capitalized on suffering in ways that would make even the coldest heart tremble. In this video, we journey into the grim world of 16th century Spain during the height of the Black Death. A detailed exploration of the role of plague doctors is revealed, showing how these men were entrusted with life and death decisions, but were often little more than death's messengers. As we peel back the layers, we discover the secret agendas that some doctors hid under their masks: greed, exploitation, and a thirst for gold that drove them to commit unimaginable acts. The second part takes us deeper into the psyche of these plague doctors. It unveils the chilling motivations behind their secret actions, how they feigned healing while actually setting up patients for execution, all for the prospect of hidden wealth. As the story expands, we see the social and psychological impact this betrayal had on families and communities already ravaged by the disease. Was this an act of survival in a brutal world, or the culmination of a deeply corrupted system? The streets of 16th century Spain are suffocating. The air is thick with the smell of rotting flesh, mingling with the acrid scent of burning herbs, an attempt to ward off the overwhelming stench of death. The Black Death, a merciless force that sweeps through Europe like a raging storm, has come again. There is no escape. The once vibrant cities are now hollow shells of themselves, their alleys filled with the feverish cries of the dying and the ominous silence of the already dead. In this world, the plague doctor is both feared and revered. His arrival, clad in black from head to toe, a grotesque mask with glass eye holes, a long hooked beak, signals that the inevitable has arrived. This is a man who offers not comfort, but death in its most terrifying form. For centuries, the plague doctor has been a necessary evil, someone whose presence is synonymous with both hope and horror. The mask, made from wax leather and glass, was said to protect the doctor from the disease itself. The beak stuffed with aromatic herbs, cloves, and spices to ward off the miasma, or bad air, which was believed to carry the plague. The outfit, complete with a long overcoat, gloves, boots, and a wooden staff, was not only meant to shield the doctor from infection, but also to separate him from the suffering of those he encountered. These were men who walked among death, their only task to diagnose, to administer cures, and to confirm what the people already knew deep in their bones, that the disease was merciless and that most would die. But beneath the stoic facade of the plague doctor's mask, there was something much darker at play. History remembers them as healers, saviors of the sick, but in reality, many were no more than profiteers of misery. capitalizing on the chaos and devastation. As Europe was ravaged by one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, these doctors found themselves in a peculiar position, entrusted with the power of life and death. Yet instead of using this power for the betterment of society, some took advantage of the epidemic for personal gain. The fear and desperation of the people became their currency, and the victims of the plague were reduced to little more than objects to be exploited. At the height of the epidemic, the plague doctor was often the first and sometimes the last person a patient would see. But what many did not know was that these doctors were sometimes not interested in curing the afflicted at all. Some believed that the sickness could not be cured, but they had little to lose in trying to manage it for their own benefit. Doctors were paid handsomely to treat the sick, but in truth many simply acted as passive observers, watching as their patients succumbed to the disease with little to no intervention. In the case of one particularly notorious doctor from Spain, the treatment came with a far more sinister agenda, an agenda that took advantage of both the sick and the dying, ultimately leading to betrayal on a scale so monstrous it is almost beyond comprehension.
Dr. Gregorio, as he was known in some circles, was a man of questionable morality even before the plague arrived. With his reputation as a plague doctor, he rose to prominence during the catastrophic outbreaks that gripped Spain, taking on the role of a healer while secretly harboring darker desires. What made him different from others in his profession wasn't just his coldness towards his patients, but his obsession with wealth and the hidden treasures buried deep within the walls of Spain's dying families. It was not uncommon for victims of the plague to pass on in a state of confusion or delirium, often clutching objects of great value: gold coins, jewels, family heirlooms. Those things that they thought would somehow protect them in the afterlife. These were treasures that, in the eyes of men like Dr. Gregorio, could be seized under the cover of the epidemic. What made his actions so terrifying was his ability to mask his true intentions. He would enter the homes of families ravaged by plague, a respected physician, his mask a symbol of his status and knowledge. He would stand by the bed of the sick, offering comforting words, all while secretly assessing their wealth. When patients eventually died, often after a cure that did nothing but hasten their end, Dr. Gregorio was the first to declare them beyond help. But that wasn't the end. He knew that the rich, the ones who lived in fear of dying alone, would hide their most precious possessions in secret corners of their homes, tucked away in drawers, beneath floorboards, or in hidden chests. In a world where wealth was power and death was imminent, these treasures were not just items, they were keys to a new life. As the plague continued its march through the streets, Gregorio used his position to systematically rob the dead. While others were dying in agony, he looted their homes, taking not just the trinkets and valuables, but also their most intimate secrets: documents, letters, promises of inheritances, deeds to land, all of which had a price. The most tragic part? No one suspected the plague doctor. For how could a man sworn to protect life also be the one who stole it away? In a city already teetering on the edge of collapse, Gregorio's actions added another layer of suffering. His greed was masked in the guise of professionalism, and his betrayal was as poisonous as the disease itself. With every patient he treated, every death he pronounced, he further cemented his place in the tragic narrative of Spain's Great Plague. In the quiet corners of those houses, amidst the whispers of the dying, a man was taking not just lives, but hopes, dreams, and futures. The stench of death wasn't the only thing filling the air. It was the scent of betrayal, creeping quietly behind every mask. The tension in the air grew heavier as the epidemic raged on.
With each passing day, the death toll mounted, and the streets became eerily silent, save for the soft rustle of cloaks as doctors moved from house to house, their masks and outfits shielding them from the sight and the smell of the destruction they left in their wake. In the homes of the afflicted, the plague doctor's role was considered vital, though increasingly many families wondered if their trusted savior was truly there to heal or to expedite the inevitable. Dr. Gregorio's method was simple, yet diabolical in its execution. He would arrive at the home of a suffering family, his presence both a sign of the looming end and an odd, twisted comfort. He would examine the patient, taking note of their symptoms, fever, sweating, and the telltale buboes. And with a practiced air, he would pronounce the verdict. The person was beyond saving, condemned by the plague. The grieving family, so deep in their desperation and helplessness, would turn to him with hope in their eyes, placing their faith in this stranger dressed as a harbinger of death. He would offer them reassurances, calming their panic with the authority of a man who held knowledge no one else did. But in truth, his reassurances were empty words, distractions to cover up his true purpose. Behind the mask, Gregorio's eyes would scan the room for anything of value. An ornate chest tucked in a corner, a beautiful piece of jewelry casually draped over the bedpost, or an old family portrait with gold leaf edges and a hidden compartment behind it. As the family mourned their loss, unaware of his plans, he would work swiftly, slipping the treasures into his pockets, taking what he could while no one was watching. If the deceased were wealthy enough, his actions could mean a small fortune. But he was meticulous, never leaving a trace behind. The family's sorrow would be overwhelming, yet as their world crumbled under the weight of grief, they would never suspect the plague doctor. The very man who was supposed to ease their suffering was the one stealing their legacy. For some, Gregorio's visit was a final act of betrayal. He had perfected his craft of manipulation, understanding just how to play the game of death. When wealthier families received word that a loved one had passed away, it wasn't uncommon for a doctor like Gregorio to offer a final consultation. Often this came in the form of a quiet conversation with the family, during which he would propose a treatment of sorts. Certain rituals, incantations, or prayers to help guide the departed soul to the afterlife. These ceremonies, of course, were expensive, and Gregorio knew just how to drive the point home. For the grieving families, the thought of spending money to ensure the soul of a loved one was safely sent off seemed like a necessary price to pay. But in reality, these rituals were nothing but a way for Gregorio to gain access to even more hidden wealth, turning the death of a loved one into a twisted transaction.
But there was another layer to this sickness, the psychological toll on the families. Their mourning, already intense and raw, was complicated by the knowledge that a man who had been entrusted with their loved one's care had taken advantage of their suffering. How much had been stolen, and how much would never be recovered? In a time when disease was an invisible enemy and the body itself betrayed its owner, could the mind truly trust anyone anymore? Gregorio's betrayal was a reflection of the mistrust that ran rampant through Spain's plague-ridden cities, a city already filled with suspicion and fear. When every cough could be the end, every stranger a potential executioner, who could be trusted? And how could the people know that the very person sent to protect them was the one who would profit from their loss? As the disease spread, Gregorio's reputation began to grow, not for his medical expertise, but for his uncanny ability to be present at the deathbeds of the richest families. Rumors started to swirl, whispers of a doctor who knew when a patient's wealth would be most vulnerable, of a man who could both heal and destroy in the same breath. It was not unusual for patients to ask for a different doctor, but by then, it was too late. The plague was an equalizer. It took all kinds, rich and poor alike, and Gregorio, with his steady hands and cold heart, was a witness to it all. But beyond the personal betrayals, something much darker was unfolding. As the plague swept through Spain, the fabric of society itself began to unravel. The disease did not discriminate. It left families shattered, communities weakened, and cities in disarray. With death came a mass exodus of wealth, as frightened families, not just of disease, but of thieves and those, like Gregorio, tried to hide their fortunes. Gold, silver, and jewelry disappeared into hidden compartments and deep basements. It was in this chaos that men like Gregorio thrived, exploiting the fear and panic of the times to line their pockets. The question that remained was not just how much he stole, but how much he had destroyed in the process. A plague was a tragedy, yes, but so was the quiet, insidious theft that occurred in its wake. And then came the twist. As much as Gregorio had benefited from the epidemic, it was also his undoing. Over time, the whispers about him grew too loud, and the very people who had once trusted him began to question his true intentions. He had been a part of a system that took advantage of the suffering, but the system itself was beginning to crumble. The plague was not the only thing spreading, and soon the greed, like the disease, would catch up with him. As the plague finally began to wane and the horrors of the epidemic faded into the annals of history, the shadow of men like Dr. Gregorio did not disappear. His actions, driven by greed and masked under the guise of healing, left behind a trail of devastation far beyond the reach of the Black Death itself. The victims of his betrayal were not just the sick who had died in his care, but the families whose trust was shattered and whose legacies were looted in their final hours. The tragedy of this story is not just in the number of lives lost, but in the realization that in a world of suffering and death, even those entrusted with our protection can betray us for their own gain. What does this dark chapter of history tell us? That power, in the hands of those who seek to profit from human suffering, can turn even the most sacred of roles, those of healer and protector, into tools of manipulation and cruelty. In the end, the Black Death was not the only thing that robbed Spain of its soul. Dr. Gregorio and his like were part of a more insidious epidemic, one of moral decay, exploitation, and the corrupting influence of greed. Perhaps the most chilling thought is this: in times of crisis, when fear and death are close at hand, how far can we trust the ones who claim to save us? The mask, after all, hides more than just the face. It hides the truth. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's darkest and most tragic tales. If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing and liking the video to help us continue bringing these forgotten yet essential pieces of history to light. Stay tuned for more stories of betrayal, mystery, and tragedy from the past. Stories that deserve to be remembered.